Oi, boa noite. Vamos fechar aqui o nosso dia hoje com mais um painel? Uma das noites mais extraordinárias de nossa história teve Grada Kilomba como protagonista. Uma multidão de mulheres negras se acotovelou nos pilotis do Museu de Arte do Rio, na região central da cidade. Foi uma noite de tanto empoderamento que a plateia interferiu na nossa curadoria, obrigando-nos a levar o orixá Conceição Evaristo para o palco. Poucos festivais literários no mundo são capazes de se ajustar aos desejos de seu público da forma como fizemos naquela noite. Dali, fomos para o Largo da Prainha, mais precisamente para a Casa Porto, de nosso amigo e parceiro Rafael Vidal. Grada assinou pacientemente, sempre com seu sorriso pleno, centenas de exemplares. Terminamos aquela noite com um desejo incontível, se não de perpetuá-la, de repeti-la. E começamos as articulações para ter o que vamos ver agora, ela numa conversa mediada pelo jornalista Desmond Cole. Tentamos, por intermédio da editora Cobogó, que desde aquela noite se tornou nossa grande parceira. Tentamos, por intermédio do Goethe Institute, parceiro da Flup, desde a primeira edição. Conseguimos, por fim, por intermédio da parceria de conteúdos que criamos com o Festival Internacional de Toronto, TIFA, que no final de semana passado exibiu o nosso Slam Queer. Sabemos que será uma noite de encantamentos, mas também para aprofundar um debate sobre um mundo pós-George Floyd, que jamais será o mesmo. Com vocês, Grada Kilomba.
Creating a literary festival is always special. It's always different, with each being a journey of creation, a response to our world. This year has been like none other, highlighting what it means to be human, and the joys and comfort found in shared experiences. As readers, we turn to books to find solace, strength, inspiration and understanding. The authors we explore are documenting the stories of our times, and helping us gain a better understanding of where the world might go next. The power of reading and the need for connection and community has inspired the 41st edition of the Toronto International Festival of Authors. And I welcome you warmly to share in this festival and our celebration of stories. Buy a book, discover new ideas, and share them with friends. Dive into this year's festival and enjoy hundreds of virtual events. Consider donating to the festival, if you can, to help support our free programme, and to help us continue to support writers. Ask big questions and bring people together as we attempt to bring our new world into focus.
We respectfully acknowledge that words and ideas have been shared on this land for thousands of years. This land that holds ancient knowledge. The land on which we operate has been occupied by the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. It is part of the Dish with One Spoon territory and is still home to many Indigenous people. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We thank those who have cared for the land and are sharing it with us. We are grateful to be here, connecting with others in the celebration of stories. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 41st edition of the Toronto International Festival of Authors, Canada's largest and longest-running literary festival. My name is Fiona Ray Clark, and I'll be chairing today's event, Deconstructing Racism, with Desmond Cole and Grada Kilomba. This event is being presented in partnership with Flup, the literary festival of the Periferias in Brazil. We'll be having a brief introduction from the authors about their respective books, an interview, and a Q&A afterwards. So please post your questions in the chat below. I'd like to welcome and introduce our two special guests. Desmond Cole is an award-winning journalist, radio host, and activist in Toronto. His writing has appeared in the Toronto Star, Toronto Life, The Walrus, Now Magazine, Ethnic Isle, Torontoist, BuzzFeed, and the Ottawa Citizen. The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power, is Cole's first book, which is a national bestseller and was recently longlisted for the 2020 Toronto Book Awards. Grada Kilomba is a Portuguese artist and writer living in Berlin. Her work draws on memory, trauma, race, gender, and the decolonization of knowledge. She is best known for her subversive writing and artistic practice of giving body, voice, and image to her own texts, using publication, staged reading, performance, installation, and video. Her work has been presented internationally. She is the author of the acclaimed Plantation Memories, a compilation of episodes of everyday racism written in the form of short psychoanalytical stories that has been translated into several languages and listed as the most important nonfiction literature in Brazil. I'd like to welcome both of you. It's great to have you here virtually.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
So I'd like to invite Grada to introduce your book.
To introduce my book, of course. Well, Plantation Memories is the main title, Episodes of Everyday Racism. I wrote this book some years ago, but the book seems to be timeless now. Still being translated in several languages and appearing in different countries. And Plantation Memories is a compilation of psychoanalytical short stories. After I did interviews with Black women, asking them to report and to tell me about the most subtle forms of everyday racism. And then I create a dialogue between the episodes that these women describe, and I psychoanalyze what they describe. So I do an analysis of how these subtle forms of racism restage the colonial violence, and how the present, our present, is kind of interrupted by the past. And we experience the present as if we were in the past, and the past comes to coincide with the present. And exactly these elements of timelessness are the elements of trauma. So this book is about looking at everyday racism as a restaging of colonial trauma, a restaging of violence, colonial violence. And it's a very psychoanalytical and very graphical book where I'm really exploring the violence of being placed as the other, of being placed outside humanity, and that can be performed in the most subtle mise-en-scène. So the book goes from episodes to episodes and from chapters to chapters, exploring how Black people and Black women in particular, who are the characters of this book, in the everyday racism, their life is being interrupted and placed in the past, placed outside humanity.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Beautiful. I'd like to invite Desmond to introduce your book.
Thank you. So The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power, is a book that I started writing in 2015, 5 years ago, and was published finally in January of this year. It took me a lot longer than I thought, but the process was worth it, I guess. The book chronicles 1 year of stories of Black resistance and struggle in different parts of this country. Many of them are framed here in Toronto and in the Greater Toronto area where I live, but I talk about stories from different parts of the country as well. And the structure of the book of this year, 2017, is that every chapter of the book represents 1 month of the year, 2017, January, February, so on, as a way of chronicling and kind of choosing one year. People often ask me, why did you pick the year 2017 to frame your book around? It's because that's when I was writing. But I could have written this book in this structure anytime. And I think I wanted to represent the way that stories of Black resistance, the struggle against white supremacy and anti-Black racism in Canada, is so intentionally obscured by our white-dominated population, by the media, by our institutions. We are very fond of contrasting ourselves with the United States of America and demeaning Black people by being like, if you're not suffering as bad as we think the Americans are, you have no right to say anything. And as a journalist, it becomes very tiresome to know that our stories here in a journalistic capacity are being completely ignored. And so this book was an opportunity for me in a much more thorough way than, doing 800-word news articles or 800-word opinion pieces, to really explore what racism against Black people in education, in child welfare, in immigration, in our health institutions with the police, all of these things, being able to talk about that in a little bit of depth, and to not just center stories on one thing that happened in 2017, which I do for each chapter, but also to go back in time a little bit. As Greta was saying, the timelessness of these things is it's not lost on me either. And what we experience today, or what I wrote about in 2017, is happening now and has been happening in Canada. And so framing things in 2017 was a jumping off point to say, what is the history of immigration in Canada going back to the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, that makes a deportation story today possible? What's the policing history? What is the history of colonialism and the theft of land from Indigenous peoples in Canada that relates to what happened in 2017, which was the celebration of Canada's 150th birthday, which I also look at a little bit in one chapter of the book. And so it was a way of weaving all of those stories together to show how we struggle, but also how we continue to fight back.
Thank you so much, Desmond. Yeah, that really struck me for both of your books, that it's grounded in time and duration in terms of Grada, yours is everyday racism, and Desmond, it's one single year, but both stretch, backward, much farther in time. And I'm really struck by the relentless feeling of white supremacy and the colonial project that you get from both of your pieces. And I wonder, what was that experience like? Desmond, writing as you go, I assume, as indicated in the book, and Grada, in looking at this and analyzing, in minute detail, these interpersonal interactions.
How the writing was?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a very long process. I mean, Desmond, when you say it took you 5 years to write that book, I admire that. I think it took me 10 years. It took me all my life to write it. It's an accumulation of knowledge, of reading, of going to the theater, going to the opera, listening to music, going to exhibitions, to capture all images and more images and words. It's really a very intense work. It's not something that comes, oh, I want to write a book, and the book, okay, I'm going to take 3 years and it's written. I think it took me several years to compose this book as it is. And I think I could have not written that book without the knowledge and the process before that. So I think writing is really a constant process. I think when you're creating a piece of art, it's a constant process, and it's not a process that starts and ends. I think when I look back, I think all my life I've been accumulating knowledge and experience that then it's captured in one artwork or in one book or in one installation or performance and continues living. So there were times I was very afraid of writing. It was very troublesome to write as well. So it's also part of the process. That to a point that I have decided not to show my writings to nobody until it is concluded, because I realized how radical my writings were and how uncomfortable people were with the writings, and each person would give an opinion of in which direction I should go. So I think this is also a very important element, especially for Black writers, that you really, like Stuart Hall says, writing from the belly of the monster, and knowing that you are inside the monster writing. And so I think this is a very important process. So it's a long process until I had the feeling it's done and it's ready, and I don't want to deal with it anymore. I want to give birth to the book, and it was published exactly 11 years ago. And the book was quite successfully in Germany when I released it at the International Literature Festival in Berlin, and it was immediately sold out. And then I got interested on adapt the book and putting it on stage at the theater. I liked this idea of making it vivid and performative. I liked this idea of producing knowledge through performance as well. Writing is always my first language, and from the writing, I like to explore the performative aspect of writing. So this is what I did back then. So it's a continuous process, and curiously, it took like 11 years. I'm from Lisbon, from Portugal. It took like 11 years to publish the book and translate it into Portuguese in Portugal, as well as in Brazil, and it was last year. So we have to deal with this sense of timelessness as well. That sometimes there's a huge delay, especially for Black artists. It takes a long time until our work is acknowledged, until society is able to read what was produced a decade ago. So sometimes I say that this book is like a blessing and a curse for me, because I'm doing other things and people now are calling me to read the book in Portuguese. And I say, well, I did that like 11 years ago, and it was, and there's so many other works, but I think this sense of timelessness is something that we all have to deal with, that sometimes we produce such radical works that society or the institutions and the festivals and the museums need some decades to be able to deal with the artistic work that we're producing. And I find that important to talk about. So it is a process, for me, continuous process. I think the book is present in all my artistic works, and each work becomes another work. So I think it's not one book. I think it's a continuous process that we do as artists and as thinkers and as writers. And I think that's quite powerful that it is so.
It is. Thank you. Yeah, very, very powerful. And Desmond, like, did you keep a journal? Like, what was your process like?
Well, just this idea from Stuart Hall of like being inside the monster while you're composing, like I really love this because I almost feel like what I was doing, the first writing I ever did as a child, Fiona, was to keep a journal. And so like, you know, I almost felt in a way that this is what this book felt in some way as for me is like that day-to-day, week-to-week kind of currency of the moment that you're experiencing. And when I started doing my journalism work about 10 years ago, one of the things I found myself doing a lot of was covering live events. So I would go to a community event, I would go to a town hall, I would go to a city hall committee meeting and cover city hall politics. But I really liked putting people in the room, I guess, as it were, and being like, I want you to read this and have an idea of what it felt like to sit here and to listen and to see. And that translated really well to things like going out when there's a demonstration happening and wanting to write about the demonstration and put people back in the position of what it sounds like when we're walking through the streets. I use a lot of audio recording in order to help myself write. And so I take audio from places and then I will be back listening later on and going back and reliving and remembering and trying to capture parts of that for people on the page. And I think that what set me in motion for this book, and you know, Grada, you're so correct about the continuity, that it's not really like discrete works so much as it is like an always evolving story. That's really how I feel like it. And a really big part of what became the skin we're in for me started when I went to Ferguson, Missouri in 2014 during the uprising for Mike Brown after he was murdered. And, you know, it was a war zone. You know, there were a couple thousand National Guard troops in this very small, like Ferguson was like 65 or so thousand people at the time that I visited there. It's not that big, but you have couple thousand National Guard patrol people in there, tanks, armored vehicles. At the police station where people would demonstrate every day, there were snipers perched on the rooftop of the building pointing their guns at us. And I chose to go into this place right after the decision not to indict Darren Wilson, the police officer who murdered Mike Brown. And it was hard because I was alone. And I would do the same thing. I would take my audio and I would speak to people and I would meet with people, and then I would go back to this hotel room by myself and try to, in all of my like pain and confusion about what I was seeing and upset about the condition that we as all Black people were in. You know, I remember the very first day that I was walking down the street taking pictures. I had brought this like big camera with me to take photographs, and I didn't really even know how to use it. And I was like trying to learn on little things here and there on a sign or whatever. How do I focus this camera? And after about 15 minutes, I realized I had wandered off and I was alone in Ferguson in this state of war by myself. And that if something now was to happen to me, nobody would even know where I went to. It was horrific, but Black people uplifted me so much during that time. And the action that I documented there was like people going and shutting down big box stores to demonstrate for Mike Brown, people doing a march through the neighborhood that he was murdered in, the NAACP doing a march, but being confronted by local people who are like, we've been out here for months in the rain, in the cold, demonstrating every day. And now NAACP, now you want to come through with the cameras and you want to come march for Mike Brown. Where have you been? And trying to tell people what it felt like, also for me as a Black person, to see these kinds of confrontations, to see Black people confronting Black police officers in Ferguson and being like, what is it like for you to be doing this role right now? I wanted people to see and to hear those things. And so when I got back home, I was different forever. And it was that year after Ferguson that I signed my book deal. And, you know, I kept working in journalism. I kept writing with the Toronto Star. I was living and witnessing what I would later write. That's how it worked for me, is a witnessing. And so as you mentioned, Grada can be a really difficult like process. I also don't show my work to anybody while I'm working on it. Until that is done, that's for me and my editor and nobody else. You know, it has been a really difficult thing. At times I wrote in this book about my own personal experiences, having to leave a job with a major newspaper, the Toronto Star, because of their racism. And that is hard to do as well for me, but it's been a very rewarding experience overall to do something like this, to have my own journal of 2017 in some ways that looks back at some of those experiences that I was witnessing, and to share that witnessing and that seeing and hearing with my audience.
Yes, thanks. I'm struck by how both of you do a lot of witnessing in both of your books, and you bring in your own personal experience, as you said, Desmond. But what was it like? Not speaking for those people, but for like sharing their witness, bearing their witness. You know, how did you keep yourself safe in that? Like, Desmond, did your journalistic practice keep you safe? And Grada, did your academic practice keep you safe? Like,
well, keeping me safe. I never thought of that. If I am safe or not. I felt more that I have something very urgent to do and to tell. So, and that I have questions that I want to answer. So, it's for me, it was never a question of safety, but a question of urgency. I wanted to have my questions answered. I wanted to understand who I am. And there I must say that I think when I was writing this book, Plantation Memories, as well as when all the other works that I have been doing, I'm not particularly interested on writing in the name of somebody else or to somebody else. I don't have this pretentious wish. I want to understand who I am. And I would love very much that all of us write many books and produce many films and many artworks. I think we need this multiplicity, that we all have our own questions and find our own answers as well. So when I did what I'm talking about, I'm also talking about this importance of freedom, that we as Black writers and as Black artists have this freedom to answer our own questions. And that maybe another Black author will write something else. And it is this accumulation of knowledge, this diversity of knowledge production that is so important to do, that we often don't have as Black artists. We are expected to represent a global world. We are expected to answer to a question that is imposed to us. So when I wrote that book, actually this book was my PhD at university. Back then, my doctorate in philosophy. And it was already very problematic because I come from psychoanalysis, working in performance, and I was doing something in philosophy. And the whole format was wrong because this is not how you write a book. So I wanted to bring the voices of these women and to have a dialogue with these women. And, the whole format was a very hybrid format. And I look back to my work, and my work is always very hybrid. And maybe it's also what Desmond is also describing, that you do all this very diverse, very hybrid work. And I think this is what the colonial work is. We do not obey to one discipline. I cannot obey to one discipline that has placed me as the other. So of course we accumulate knowledge and we create a very hybrid language to understand our reality. And I like that. So when I wrote the book, it was not about safety, it was about urgency. And it was about the urgency to break the rules and to write a PhD in the form of short stories and bring cultural studies, queer studies, feminism, gender studies, Black studies, and performance all together in one, and bring all this dialogue into one. And that was also a very intense and beautiful work to do. And I had a lot of fun doing it. Sometimes I was very fearful. That's when I stopped presenting, because everybody would tell me in these institutions, this is not how you write a PhD, and this is not how you do so, and this you will never publish that book. Then I wrote a book in English, even though my language is Portuguese, but I had a fellowship from the German government, so I was here in Berlin. I chose to write in a language that is not mine. So I think we all then cross these borders. And it's important to remind the younger generation that you should be experimental, and you should not follow the protocol, and you should not listen so much to what other people are telling you, because I think what is very urgent is actually to break the rules and to be disobedient and to create a new language and a new vocabulary and a new format. And to cross disciplines, and that was very urgent. It was not about safety, it was an urgency. And Desmond, you spoke how you were coming into writing. I was dreaming a lot. So I had a little book and a pen next to my bed, and I had all these dreams, and I used dreaming as my studio, as my working space. I dreamed a lot. Sometimes I would just go to do a short nap, and then I had these sentences and these thoughts coming together. So it was such an intense work. I was completely removed from the outside to write that book. Yes, that was my creative process.
What you're saying it's so beautiful. I really relate to this idea of urgency too, Grada, because I feel like in many ways what I was doing was rushing into unsafety, was like finding myself in spaces and looking at experiences and stories that actually show how we are not safe, how this world is not offering us this idea of safety, and that's where a lot of our struggle is coming from, is trying to conceive of what safety would even be in the present circumstances that we find ourselves in. A 6-year-old girl in her school in Mississauga being handcuffed, being shackled by her wrists and ankles by 2 police officers who responded after the school called them to come get this 6-year-old Black girl. A parent trying to send their child to primary school, having to get the call that your daughter has been shackled inside of a classroom by police officers. What safety? What safety? It almost starts from a place of what safety? Why can't we have an experience in the grocery store or at school or in the academy or at work without constantly looking over our shoulder, without constantly trying to interpret what did that last comment mean, or am I going to lose my job if I try to speak up today, or like, these things come from a lack of safety and from a searching for a way to navigate a world that is constantly like pointing a weapon at you as a Black person. And so certainly I don't think there's safety for me. I don't think that there's safety for the people whose stories I am sharing. There is connection, we hope. There is a sense that we are being seen and heard by telling stories, that experiences that we have are just being made real. Like another thing that Grada just said was about like the stage, you know, and I have never written a play, but I often think that I could have written this book in some ways as a play, or that I would like to do that kind of work in the future, because of what that how I like to cover things live as they're happening. That's what, for me, a great theater performance feels like. You're being pulled into live events that are taking place in front of you and being forced to process them, and you're reacting to them, and they're challenging you, hopefully, you know. And that is not always a safe place either, but that's okay, because I totally agree with this notion that we need to break barriers, and we need to make, we need to take risks, I guess, in order for the work that we're doing to have meaning. And in order for, in my case, like, I'm very committed to what I see as a Black liberation struggle that we're all engaged in. There's nothing safe about that. But what you try to do is, when you tell somebody else's story, you let them use their own words, certainly, and you're faithful to their words. You're faithful to their experiences of how they see and feel things. You do your homework to try to contextualize where have people expressed in our country and in our city this thing before. What have we as experience from other Black writers and thinkers and historians that can help us understand what somebody right now in our time is going through? And people take a lot of risks in order to be able to tell these stories. And I think the value is that, like, that risk taking is a form of showing how much we love one another, showing how much we're going to try and serve each other with this work that we're doing by taking risks and by being unsafe sometimes, if that's what's necessary.
Thank you to you both. And I guess you both referred to the most unsafe situations for Black lives and Black individuals, and Grada, you referred to Black female suicide, and Desmond, you referred to Abdiraham Abdi, whose killer was recently found not guilty. You know, how do you avoid a sense of fatalism in this struggle, in this work, and not give into complacency?
Well, you know, when I wrote that book, and I think in the works that I want to do, I think I like to explore this complexity of being Black. And I think the importance of being so complex and of having so many different layers. Last month, I think we just opened an exhibition in Johannesburg, and the last work I did, and it's titled Heroines, Birds and Monsters. And this is exactly what I find important us to do, to present ourselves in this complexity. And I think when I was writing the book, the politics of suicide is one of the chapters, but there are many different chapters. And each of the women are present in all these different chapters. So suicide or death was mentioned by all of them, so it became a chapter of the book. But many other chapters are there as well. And there comes a moment that I thought it's very important to redefine a little bit what empowerment is. I am this generation, I think all of us that grew up with the idea of empowerment is to be the best and to be the nicest and to be the better than the others, and you cannot fail. You have to go to school and you have to be extremely good, and you cannot speak loud, and you cannot get dirty, and you have to be an example to the Black community. And we grew up under this pressure of opposing racism as an ideal self. So if racism places as the idealized self, we at home are told to become the ideal self, the example. And for me, it was very important while writing this book that I do not want to be neither one nor the other. I don't want to be ideal, and I don't want to be disideal. I don't want to be worse, and I don't want to be better. I think the liberty of becoming human is exactly to have the liberty to be yourself. And to be yourself means that sometimes you know and sometimes you don't. And sometimes you have an answer, and sometimes you cannot answer. And sometimes you laugh, but sometimes you cry. And to have this freedom that we often do not have as Black people, to have the freedom of being humans. And many times this is for me what empowerment is. And many times we have the pressure of being the best, the ideal humans. And that was very important for me to desidealize during this book, to present the women in this complexity, that we are human beings and we function in this complexity. And if I am allowed to function in this complexity, then I have the freedom to be a human. If I have to be an ideal, then the rules that are applied to me are not the human rules. I have to be extra good. And we live under that pressure. And I wanted to dismantle that. I wanted to present us in these different chapters where suicide appears, as you said, but it appears many other things, many other aspects such as desire, such as there are many different stories. One of them that it comes to my mind now, that was one of the most beautiful chapters to write about, was when women started describing how they greet Black people when they pass on the street, which is a common practice here in Europe. Every single time you see a Black person, you greet from a child, from little one. You always say, and you always greet everybody, even if it's on the other side of the corner of the street. You always greet. You always nod your head, and then it was so beautifully described, and I linked that greeting into the whole theory of trauma and all how we were fragmented from our history and separated. It's a history of genocide and a history of separation and fragmentation. And how this greeting is a moment of empowerment, a moment of unity. And so there's all these beautiful aspects that are there. And I find important to remember that. I find important, especially for a younger generation, to remind them that they don't have to be ideal. They just have to be themselves. And they have to have the right and the freedom to know or not to know, and to be able or not to be able, just like all the others, and to go into that process of becoming. And I think this is one of the most empowering messages we can do in our writing, in our books, when we deliver our works to the audience.
Thank you. Thank you, Grada. I just wanted to remind before, Desmond, you have a chance to answer, please put your questions in the chat. Desmond, to you.
Well, thank you for asking about the story of Abdurrahman Abdi. You know, may God rest his soul. For those who don't know this story, which is chronicled in one chapter of my book, Abdurrahman was 37 years old when he was murdered in the summer of 2016 by a police officer, by two police officers, really, who chased him through the streets of Ottawa, ultimately confronting him at the front door of his own apartment and beating him in front of that front door of his apartment. You know, the police officer who was charged with manslaughter, Daniel Monsian, he was found not guilty of all the charges against him, including a manslaughter homicide charge, about a week and a half ago now. And, you know, when you ask about fatalism, I feel like the difficulty of us experiencing this kind of violence is that it is a mind trap, that it is so powerful, the violence is, that it compels us to wonder if there is another way to live, if we can escape it, if something else is possible. And so I can't, through some cleverness of thought or expression, just tell people, yeah, you know, it can be better than this, or it can be, you know, there's going to be a better day for Black people, even though these are the kind of things that the police can do. I mean, the judge in that case said that he didn't have enough evidence, essentially, to conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that beating a man unconscious and then leaving him to lie there actually caused his death. That was the ruling from a judge in Ottawa. This is no different from the lynching of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor in her home, DeAndre Campbell in Brampton, Ontario, being murdered after he called the Peel Regional Police for help, Ijaz Chowdhury, Chantel Moore, Aisha Hudson. I could go on. Of course, there is despair in having to confront that the police can do this to us over and over and over again. But what I really want is for us to go back to that place that says that it is impossible and insurmountable, and to try and dream. Despite all of the constraints that are being put on us. You know, I say at one point in my book that, you know, Abdurrahman, who lived with mental health issues, you know, people were clearly afraid of this Black man who was an immigrant from Somalia, whose first language was not English. There was a certain kind of social reaction to him. And I hope that we can try to imagine that when people wanted to respond to him, that there was a different way than the one that went down, that we did not have to be trapped in the violent offering that is the only offering that this like white supremacist state can give us, which is that we're too afraid to confront you as Black people one-to-one. We have to bring the gun, we have to bring the taser, we have to bring the dogs and the bulletproof vest, because there is no other safe way for us to meet with Black and Indigenous people one-to-one in this society as equal. It's like daring to dream that Abdurrahman could have been responded to that day with care and kindness in a world that tells us that that is not possible, that that wouldn't have been safe, that treating him with love and care would have put somebody else at risk, and trying to refuse that kind of a zero-sum equation, as entrenched as it is in our minds and as entrenched as it is in the practices that we see around us. And so I would say, and for anybody, you know, who may be trying to do that kind of work and organizing, we do not have to compromise with a state that refuses to see our humanity. We have to dream bigger than what they think is possible. We have to break the boundaries. That's actually a huge part of the work, is that when they say, we'll put a camera on the police officer next time so that we can film your death. And who knows, maybe that'll make things better. Maybe it won't. We're just going to give you something, Black people, so that you will shut up and go away. That our response to that has to not be to negotiate our lives down, not to say the white settler state will not actually abolish the police, so we shouldn't ask for it. The creation of a different world is exactly what we are striving for, and being willing to demand the impossible, I think, is like an important starting point. Our ancestors perished at the bottom of the ocean. And those of us who survived, our ancestors who made it and were able to struggle through like what came afterwards. I'm talking personally here because that's my ancestry, being stolen from Africa, as Bob Marley said, right? Would it not be impossible at that moment to try and conceive that you were going to get out of, and your family and your descendants were going to get out of that situation that was so beneficial and continues in this white supremacist capitalist world to be so beneficial to such a small group of people? It is impossible to think that that could have ever ended, and it hasn't, but that's what we want. And we either spend the rest of our lives negotiating down from an unacceptable starting point, or we try to take those risks and crash through and dream. And that's why this notion of abolition is so captivating to me now as I get older and as I try to. I was a very much liberal, reformist, even a few years ago. I was very much like, maybe we can work within these systems. Maybe I should run for political office. Maybe we should work within the confines of what the white supremacist state will let us do, because trying to imagine something bigger than that seems too overwhelming, tiring, scary, impossible. And now I am like, but what actually gives us life and what gives meaning to us is the ability to say that something other than that is actually possible, and to push for that rather than bargaining back down our own beauty and our worth and our value as people.
Thank you so much for that, Desmond. Yeah, that beauty to dream. And you touched a little bit on Tony's question, which we didn't have full time to ask, but you know, as to what white folks can do and whether we should work within the political system. But I think like just dreaming bigger than it, and as you said, Grada, breaking the rules. Yeah, I think are far better solutions possibly.
Can I just say something really quick? Because I have not been on a panel this year where a white person has not asked, what can I as a white person do? And I don't have the answer for you. And you need to stop asking that question. Because if your own humanity and salvation is not threatened by what is happening around you, I don't know how to help you. You're not helping me, you're not saving me, you're not coming to rescue me. And you know, if I tell you, give up all your worldly possessions tomorrow and follow me, will you do it? Like, you can't ask us as Black people this question. You have to stop. You have to stop. Being in confrontation with these forces that are attacking us, nobody taught us how to do that. We were not born with that knowledge or that understanding, and even that desire in many cases. So don't ask me. But if you think that it is hell to witness the kind of white supremacist settler violence, the theft of Indigenous territory, the jailing in Canada, 3 times more Black people in jail than our share of the population, Indigenous people, 5 times more their share of the population in jail than in the regular population. If that is not hell for you and doesn't encourage and inspire and stir up something in you, please do not ask me. I have to figure this shit out myself, and you do too. But there's lots of example out there that you can take this kind of inspiration, thought, critical analysis from. But stop asking us, because like, I'll be like, yo, just put down all your belongings and meet me in the square tomorrow, and we're gonna go and march into these buildings, and you might not be ready for that. So don't ask unless you're like really down, because like, it's not really for me or any Black person to have to like tell you how to respond to in a situation of injustice that we have all collectively inherited.
Thank you. Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you, Desmond. Thank you, Grada, for this wonderful conversation. Thank you to everyone watching at home. Links to both Desmond and Grada's books are available on the event webpage, courtesy of the University of Toronto Bookstore, the exclusive online bookseller for this year's festival. You can also follow the festival at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Festive Authors. And to learn more about TIFA's events, you can join their mailing list. Thank you once again. This was an incredible conversation and much needed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.